Recording in progress.
Hello, sisters. Hello, sisters. Today, I am delighted to be talking with Julia Long about Janice Raymond's book, A Passion for Friends Towards a Philosophy of Female Affection from 1986. And the book is published by Spinifex Press, the wonderful feminist press from Australia. And Joe is going to put the link into the chat, because I think when you hear what Julia and I have to say about it, you will be very interested in this book. Now, I probably don't need to introduce Julia at length. At least she says I don't need to. But I have to say she is a radical feminist force of nature from the UK. And some of you will already know that. So I'm going to start off by giving a short bio of Janice Raymond. Janice is an American feminist philosopher, and she's a professor emerita of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where she taught for many years. Now, her first book was The Transsexual Empire, which was published in 1979. And it was for many years the only feminist critique at any length of the practice of transsexualism, now called transgenderism, which said that transgenderism had its origins in male power and the subordination of women. It's a wonderful foundational book, but there was nothing for many decades after that. A Passion for Friends was her second book. And she went on to write Women as Wombs, which is a critique of reproductive technology, and that was published in 1993. And Not a Choice, Not a Job, which is a critique of men's prostitution abuse of women, in 2013. And in 2021, of course, she wrote Doublethink, which brings up to date her critique of what is now called transgenderism. From 1994 to 2007, Jan was the co-executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women in America, which I was involved in from Australia. And she's currently on the board of directors of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Her work, particularly this book, has been very important to developing the politics of lesbian feminism, as well as the feminist campaign to end prostitution. Now, usually at this point I say, why did you choose this book? But neither of us knows exactly who chose this book, although it's very good that we're talking about it. So what I'm going to do first of all is just ask Julia to say why she thinks this book is important, as she does.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Morning, Sheila. Morning, everybody. Yeah, I don't remember choosing this book, so I mean maybe I did, but I don't remember it. But I think I saw it on the list, and I knew that I wanted to talk about it with you, because obviously it's such an important book. It's got a lot of resonance for me, because I remember when I first read it, I think at the time I was living in New York. I'd just done the Women's Studies MA at Bradford with it was Jalna Hanna who was leading that then, and we had lecturers like Kumkum Bhavnani, and I remember that was really the first time that I'd been really immersed in women's studies and in women only spaces and community, and it had really been quite a life-changing time for me. And then I'd gone on to live with some friends in New York just for a few months until I moved back down south, and I was volunteering at the Women's Centre. It was a very lively, active time, and I associate that book very much with that time. But I think I also wanted to talk about it because I'd read part of it again, but I hadn't read the whole thing for a long time. And there are two words that, as I was rereading it, that just kept coming into my mind. the one was depth, like the depth of her thinking and her examination of the topic and her analysis. I just find really rare actually these days, and really, really sort of deeply satisfying. And the other one is the seriousness of it, the fact that she takes what she terms gyne affection and female friendship so seriously as a topic of philosophical examination and exploration. Again, I just find very, very satisfying, and I think it is a very rare book. I don't know of any others that certainly not, you know, at the moment that are treating this subject with this kind of depth and centrality. So yeah, so I guess that was why I wanted to talk about it. How about you, Sheila?
Yes, I read the book in '86. I know I did that because when I went back and looked at it now, I did find a letter in the book, which is from Jan Raymond, which is from February 1986. And I have to say at this point, how important letters are. Imagine finding a letter. I am not going to find an email from 25 years ago anywhere hanging about. And indeed, every email I've ever written is gone into the mists of time. But there used to be a record of our correspondence with each other in the form of letters. And thankfully, I've got a lot of them, but it's so lovely to see a letter. And I think it was in the book. I think she sent me the book or gave me the book, and the letter was in there. So that's lovely. Now, about that context in 1986, when I read it, I was in the US, and so I was in Worcester, Massachusetts. I was visiting Jan a bit, and we were speaking at conferences together, and so on. So that was good, and it was the time of extraordinary passion, because it was the time of the feminist so-called sex wars that lesbian feminists and radical feminists were having to confront women promoting sadomasochism and pornography at that time. And there was a huge battle of ideas going on. But Jan brought out this really, really positive book. And I think, as Julia says, what's amazing is that she takes our relationships between each other as feminists and lesbians seriously. She sees them as important. And there was a huge feminist community at the time, of course, a wonderful, strong bonds between women, in fact, and this book is about those bonds, but also the obstacles to them. And she argues that women's friendship, the gyne affection, is the very basis of this extraordinary community and of all of our political work. It's very difficult now to imagine any such book because there's no feminist community. There's no connections between women of this kind. So it came out of a time when it was possible to think as positively as she does. And I think that's what's so wonderful about the book, is though there's a lot of criticism of what's going on in there, basically it's about that extraordinary community and the extraordinary connections that we had. So it's a book that I think is inspirational. I think it still is now, in that it's teaching us again how we can take our relations with each other seriously. Now, what I'm going to do is, we're now going to talk about this bits of the book that we found really interesting, Julia and I. And I'm going to ask Julia, first of all, to actually talk about this very important concept in the book, gyne affection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Sheila. I mean, maybe if just very briefly I give for anyone who hasn't read it or hasn't read it for a while, if I give a very, very brief kind of thumbnail overview of the whole thing, and then sort of see how the gyne affection, you know, serves as the fundamental sort of informing concept of the whole book. But I thought I'd begin with a quotation that I think really captures what the book is about. It comes from actually very late on in the book, page 207. She says, this book is based on the conviction that it is not possible for women to be free, nor to be realistic about the state of female existence in a man-made world, nor to struggle against those forces that are waged against us all, nor to win, if we do not have a vision of female friendship, if women do not come to realise how profound are the possibilities of being for each other, as well as how deeply men have hidden these possibilities from us. And I really like that quotation because I think it does really capture what the the purpose of the book is. But yeah, so at the beginning, she sets out I think in the introduction, she sets out the main concept of the book, gynaffection, and then the related concepts of hetero relations and hetero reality. And I think these three concepts are really very much of what the book is examining. So maybe just to begin with the first two and then come on to gynaffection, because I think there's probably more we want to say about the concept of gynaffection. What she says about hetero relations, and she's quite careful to say that hetero relations and hetero reality aren't just kind of reducible to heterosexuality, but they're about hetero relations, she says, is where's my notes now, but that hetero relations are all the structures and arrangements and practices that men have established through the overarching structure of patriarchy that mean that women are for men, that women's purpose is to be there for men. And she talks about that quite early on page 10. That she says, yes, we live in a hetero-relational society where most of women's personal, social, political, professional, and economic relations are defined by the ideology that woman is for man. So that's what she's talking about when she's talking about hetero relations. And then hetero reality is the social and political and economic reality that comes about as a result of that sort of ideology. So what she says then, that gynaffection in relation to that, or in some kind of opposition or resistance or otherness to that, is she defines as woman to woman attraction, influence, and movement. So it's about women's friendship with other women, but it's about fundamentally women being primary for each other, women putting other women first, and that is the kind of defining aspect of gynaffection. And I think it's quite interesting the way that she often, because she's writing philosophically, she takes the meaning of a word and explores different aspects of it, as she does much later on in the book with the idea of vision. She takes the two different definitions of vision, but here she takes different meanings of the word affect and affection. So she takes the meaning, probably the more common one, of emotion, attraction, love, and she puts that at the heart of gynaffection. But also she, I think, politicizes it by talking about affect in the sense of achieving, influencing or achieving change or affecting the world. So she's talking about the way in which gynaffection can also create an affect in terms of influencing, motivating and encouraging each other, and then in turn influencing and changing the world. So does that seem reasonable? Have I captured it? I know then maybe we want to talk about the way in which she discusses, there's a section where she discusses gynaffection and lesbianism, and she distinguishes between the two. And I know we were talking about that before, so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Sheila.
I might just say a little bit more about hetero reality, and then I think we should come back to that question, because it really is important. And the very, very beginning of the book, the example she gives, and I used to give this to my students year after year teaching about heterosexuality as an institution and so on, was that, if a couple of women are together somewhere, a man will come up, say in a pub, or a man will come up and say, "Are you two on your own?" meaning that women are not seen as, significant enough to have relationships with each other. How could they possibly? Men will always be important, and men will always be the most important. And of course, that's how the world has been organized in hetero reality. Women are insignificant, and so men must be the most important, must be the friends, and so on and so on. I think another example that she gives of hetero reality, which I quite like, she's talking about the way in which women's bonding with each other, and she gives historical, obviously in the book, many examples of historical bonding between women, and the way that men seek to disrupt it, particularly now. We are in the century of, or we were, I used to say this in the 20th century, we're now in the 21st, but an extraordinary time of the imposition of heterosexuality on life since the development of the science of sexology, and that scientifically and in every way heterosexuality has been absolutely enforced. Women are not allowed to have any spaces to be with each other now without men there. An example she gives is childbirth. In the 20th century, and presumably it is still continuing, there's a campaign to get men into birthing rooms, even though very often they certainly don't wish to be there. They don't want to be confronted with any of that. Whereas traditionally, women were in birthing rooms, and it was a way in which women communicated with each other and supported each other. Of course, childbirth was taken over by the science of gynecology, which was male, and there's a long history of that. But now male partners have to be in the birthing room. So it's all of this splitting of the bonds that can potentially exist between women, even over things that are very, very crucially important to who women are. So hetero reality and hetero relations is, as she says, absolutely dominant. Now, if we just return to talking about gynaffection and lesbianism, because I think that is crucial. I feel that in the book she shifts around a bit about this. She doesn't make it absolutely clear, possibly because she's not wanting to offend the heterosexual women who are reading the book. And at this point, I should probably say that way back in 1982, I think it was, Mary Daly was in London speaking about her book Gynecology, or maybe 1980. And I remember being in the audience at that time, and she was talking about spinsters all the time. So I jumped up in the audience, as I used to do, and said, by spinster, do you mean lesbian? And Mary Daly looked a bit cross. She was a bit cross, I think, that I'd asked the question, and said, of course I mean lesbians. So I think this is possibly a problem of these wonderful radical feminist lesbian feminists. They didn't wish to lose the heterosexual audience, and indeed there's plenty for heterosexual women in this book, as there is in gynecology. But for the lesbian feminists who are writing these books, it's lesbians who are front and foremost in their minds. So does she, by gynaffection, mean lesbianism? Is lesbianism a part of it? What do you think, Julia?
Well, she's quite careful in that section, in the introduction, to distinguish between the two. But I agree. I think it's maybe not immediately clear, because if gynaffection she's defining as women being primary for other women, then it's a bit hard to see really where heterosexuality kind of fits with that. At the same time, I think she also says that just being lesbian doesn't necessarily mean, because later on she talks about assimilation, doesn't she? And so she says, like, being lesbian doesn't necessarily mean that you are primary for women in the way that that she thinks is so crucial in this book. So she says something somewhere about that to kind of converge the two or merge the two is patronizing to heterosexual women and shortchanging lesbians. So she's clear that there is a distinction. To me, it was, I don't know, kind of reminiscent of, that Adrienne Rich, the idea of the lesbian continuum, where she tries to, in that essay, she tries to establish this continuum between like mothers and sisters, and as having this kind of this sort of lesbian, I don't know, dimension or whatever. And I know that that has been not very well received, particularly from across the board from lesbians, because
I wonder if
she criticizes that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder if Janice Raymond was particularly conscious of that and trying to avoid it. And I guess in terms of maybe also because there's such a specific understanding. The word lesbian has got a very specific connotations and understanding, and so if she wants to talk about women who might be celibate or might not have sexual relationships or even like romantic relationships with other women, that she wants to include and capture all of their experience, as she does later on, in the sort of genealogies. She wants to include their experience within it. I guess that's why she's choosing this sort of broader term. But probably, maybe it was something to do with the readership as well, because I think as soon as someone sees like lesbian in the title, if they're not lesbian, then they're going to think, oh, that book's not for me. Whereas if you're talking about a philosophy of female affection and using the word friends, I think that's, all women are going to see something in that that's going to speak to them. So.
Yeah, and I think it's great that a lot of women will get a lot out of this book who are definitely not lesbians. But I think this issue of, are women prime? Are they the most important to you? Well, it can't fit with heterosexuality. I mean, the husband or the boyfriend will not be happy if you say, my female friends are much more important to me, women are much more important to me than you are, women come first in my life. Well, that can't fit with heterosexuality. It may be true, but it can't fit with our understanding of what heterosexuality is. So I think it's tricky to work out how all that fits together. But definitely, I mean, for me, obviously, being a lesbian feminist and a separatist, women are first in my life and have been for 50 years. There's no question about that. And so we used to talk much at the time this book was written and before about, how women were first in our life. We can't have a revolution unless they are. Whereas women who are heterosexual go home to Danny or Raymond or whatever, and they have to be the most important person in their lives because that's how it is.
And I think also, given that she's kind of taken time to, map out, as you were saying, like the idea of hetero reality and hetero relations and, all of the kind of structures of that, it's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit maybe dodging the issue if you're then defining gyne affection so broadly, because obviously the whole structures, the whole cultural and social structures around heterosexuality, like, the coupledom, the marriage, the nuclear family, all of these kinds of things are the very structures that completely militate against the thriving of gyne affection, because they keep women separated in the kind of primary relationships with men. So it's maybe it's a bit of a tension or a contradiction that she doesn't really get together, sort of thrash out in that sort of defining.
She's not specific. I mean, she does say, as Julia mentioned, that hetero relations are not specifically about heterosexuality. They are a structure and a way of relating, making men primary and enforcing male power. So she does explain, of course, that hetero relations can, as she says, function quite smoothly in the lives of lesbians who merely commit lesbian sex acts, or in the lives of women who make of lesbianism a lifestyle. Hetero relations can function specifically in lesbian role-playing, in lesbian S&M, and in the lesbian objectification of other women. Because at that time, there was a great deal of discussion of lesbian feminist ethics and philosophy and how we should relate to each other, and hetero relations, as she says, and I think we generally did understand, could exist in lesbian relationships, but not in lesbian feminist relationships. I think it's really important to say. Now, I think another important thing about the introductory chapter is that she simply states that women do choose to be lesbians. She says that quite straightforwardly in one sentence. She doesn't bother to justify it, simply because it was so well known at that time. Thousands and thousands and thousands of women were enthusiastically becoming lesbians and have been lesbians now all of their lives and had wonderful lives. And that was so accepted that actually talking about lesbians was not talking about something separate or from the community of women. So many lesbians were simply crossing over that line, falling into the arms of women at the disco, getting excited by them at meetings or whatever. So it was a whole sort of environment of love and passion for women that was going on. So lesbians were not something separate. But nowadays, if you say that, sorry, Julia, do carry on.
No, I was just going to say something that I noticed as well is that she doesn't use the term political lesbianism. And from that era, well, I read the book a bit later, it's all about the early, about 1990, 91. Although I can't really remember, we were aware of the Leeds pamphlet, that put the term political lesbianism on the map, but it wasn't a term that was particularly used. I think because it wasn't really needed. So in that way, because it was just seen, as she states here, it was just seen as nothing really very controversial. That it was a very kind of familiar phenomenon that women who had previously been heterosexual or thought they were heterosexual would then either actively choose, or just through a process of kind of immersion and development would then quite organically then become lesbians. So I think we didn't even really, I certainly don't remember particularly using that term or hearing the term political lesbianism in the way that we do now, because I think now it's kind of become maybe more necessary to highlight that. But at the time it was just totally given that was a very, very common experience that a lot of women shared, and we didn't even need to distinguish. Do you see what I mean? I
absolutely really see what you mean. And I am in the situation now, in the last sort of year, 18 months, of getting quite a lot of communications, not only when I go to other countries to speak, but by email and so on, saying, Sheila, I'm sorry to have to ask you this and take your time, but how do you become a lesbian? Which is absolutely fascinating and wonderful. And it's from young women, and they really, really want to be lesbians, but they say there's absolutely no support for them. There's huge pressure to be heterosexual. And I have to say, well, it's so much harder for you because we have this extraordinary community out of which this book came, in which women were flopping over and becoming lesbians from one day to the other with huge celebration and great joy all the time. And there was such support for it. Well, of course, the wonderful young women today contemplating this in Russia or wherever they are, they don't have any of that community around them. They don't have the disco or the meetings or the conferences or the theatre to fall in love with women at. I mean, none of that is possible. So it's a different world. But what's very exciting is that so many women have this impulse now. They see feminism, they get involved, and the first thing is they want to ask me, how do you become a lesbian? So I'm becoming this sort of sex advice auntie.
I don't know what you think about this, Sheila. I must say, I find this, the kind of focus on identity, actually quite strange. This idea that I am this thing now, and there's this thing over there that I want to become, and I have to do some sort of work on myself in order to become that. For me, because I had these that the life at that time when I was kind of in my mid-20s, I guess, because I had this life that was very immersed in women's studies and women's work and women's community, and within that I spent a lot of time with lesbians that I hadn't done before. For me, it was much more of an organic thing. It was that what hadn't felt very possible suddenly became not only possible but actually fairly, routine and normal. I could see in other women's lives. So for me, it wasn't that I saw this thing over there called lesbian and I wanted to become that, and what do? Oh, I have to cut my hair and change my shoe. It wasn't about that, but it was about then quite organically living a life that was going in a certain direction, just as if you joined, I don't know, a music college, and then maybe you do have this idea, I want to become a concert pianist, so this is what I'm going to do. But it was actually more about living that life and then having different experiences, different desires, different feelings, and then putting a name onto that, rather than the name obviously then was lesbian, but it kind of went that way, rather than, oh, I've got to be this thing over there and how do I do it? Do you see what I mean? I think we've become so...
That's the problem now, is that then we were caught up in the wave. And it was a wave. Women were becoming lesbians, you know, everywhere in huge numbers. It would have been very, very, very hard as the wave pulled you into itself to actually resist it, you know, with the pebbles rushing about under your feet and you can't keep your balance. It would have been impossible, really, I think, to resist it. Certainly for me, the wave that was lesbianism. Whereas these young women now, it's, you know, more of an individual thing because the wave is simply not there.
I think it's interesting though that it does become it becomes very much this question about individual identity, like, oh, there's this thing and how do I become it, rather than a feeling of how do I want to relate with other women and how do they relate to it, and then putting a name onto that. Do you see what I mean? I think, to me, it seems part of the whole focus on identity politics, that it becomes more of a project of the individual self.
No, I don't think it is. I think these wonderful young women just desperately also wish to be lesbians and don't know how to do it. I don't think they think it's an identity at all. No. I think they want to join in with us, but they don't really know how, and there's no obvious way to do that now. But anyway,
okay.
Apart from that diversion, and I think it's not a diversion in terms of the book, because the book very much makes you think about all of that. Let's think about the sort of central chapters of the book, and the first chapter of the book is on the origins of the origins of female friendship. Now, I didn't have a lot, I thought, to think or say about this. Did you, Julia? Was there anything you wanted to say about this chapter?
I mean, I'm aware we're kind of halfway through already. So I suppose, I think in that origin, so she's obviously trying to establish this genealogy of female friendship in light of the fact that it's been so erased and there's such a sort of lack of consciousness. And I think that's where some of the things that you were talking about, like she talks about the disciplines of psychology and biology, and how a lack of awareness of gynaffection has then meant that those disciplines have become very much about unexamined reinforcement of hetero reality and hetero relations. I think she talks about that. Then she talks about the she analyzes some of Wuthering Heights and some literature, but yeah, no, I think maybe we should just go straight on to the substantive historical chapters in the middle. So shall I say something?
Talk about the chapter about nuns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So so in this the chapter about nuns, is what I've noticed is that she's a bit erratic in where she dates things. So you kind of, that chapter covers several centuries, and she doesn't always particularly specify which century she's talking about. She jumps around a little bit, but she begins, she's mainly talking about the phenomenon of nuns and the convents and orders as locations where gynaffection could flourish, although not without its problems. And she sort of kind of briefly traces from where she's talking about pre-Christian eras, where women had more power and more independence and more autonomy from men, the impact of Christianity on really crushing that. And she says that so for women who were independently minded, who didn't want to be contained within marriage and childbearing and all of that, the convent could be a very attractive place which afforded women the kinds of opportunities that would be very, very unlikely that they would find elsewhere. She begins by talking about the Beguines, who who I think flourished in kind of Central Europe from about the 13th to the 16th century, who weren't actually nuns as such, that they were lay orders. And I thought that was a really interesting section where she talks about that, where the kind of communities that they established, the fact that they were it was such an attractive life for women that someone someone says early on that the movement of the Beguine movement spread like a contagion across those Central European countries, and I just thought, oh, it's like, what other movement do we recognize as spreading like a contagion at the moment? It's yeah, a lot more nefarious than the Beguine movement. But she talks about the whole kind of culture of women living autonomously as part of the Beguine community, sharing houses, leaving property to each other, the kind of mentoring of older women to younger women. But obviously, because they were a lay order, that was something that the sort of central authorities of the church found threatening, and really they weren't going to tolerate it for very long. And then there was an order sometime in the early 14th century that condemned them, and then they were basically those Beguine communities were dissolved and forced out, and then women were left to either join more formal convents, or starved, and or married, or actually were forced into prostitution. And she spends quite a bit of time talking about the relationship between, which I think people might find quite surprising, about the relationship between ideas of convents and also prostitution. But in terms of the culture of the convent, she talks about the kinds of culture that could flourish there for women, the scholarship, the art, the sort of literary pursuits, the creation of a kind of intellectual, spiritual, and political domain where women could really thrive autonomously away from men. And she talks about particular characters such as Roswitha of Gandersheim and Hilda of Whitby, who had a lot of political and economic power, both within and outside of the church. So she looks at all of those kind of opportunities, but then she also looks at, I mean, one of the things I think I was a bit surprised that she doesn't focus on that much is the actual content of the lives of those women, in terms of, like, she talks about the literary pursuits and the spiritual pursuits, but obviously all of those would be centered around the notion of a male god. It was all around religious doctrine. And I don't know what you think, Sheila, I found it a bit surprising that, to me, there's such a contradiction there, that these convents were these, women's communities, but it was all to the greater glory of God. And to me, that's such a glaring contradiction. I don't think she doesn't really talk about that, as I remember. She does talk about the kinds of frameworks, that the sort of the kind of moral and religious kind of instructive frameworks within the convents, and the kinds of limitations and restraints on the particular type of friendship and affection that could flourish. So there's this idea of spiritual friendship and a real kind of disapproval of what was termed like particular friendship, the idea of having too much affection for one particular individual, that was seen as against both charity and chastity. It was seen as against charity, in that if you had a particular affection or fondness, or wanted to spend too much time with one other individual at the within that kind of religious order, that would be seen as undermining of the wider community, and as being irreligious, in that it's kind of putting someone in a place that should be reserved for God, but also then against the ideas of chastity. And then she goes on to talk about how not only in the Middle Ages, but much later, she talks about her own experience of life within the convent, where and she spent, as we were talking about the other day, that she spent 12 years in the convent, and she was subjected to some very harsh kind of criticism and punishment for even just sitting and holding hands with another of the nuns in the convent, and the woman that she'd been holding hands with actually left the following year. And it's quite it seems kind of absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely bizarre to us that the novice mistress, who was basically chastising them for this, compared compared their holding hands as imitating sexual intercourse, so it kind of gives an idea of the kind of limitations that were imposed. And anyway, and then going back to the sort of I don't know, 15th, 16th century, she then talks about the dissolution of the convents and how women, with the Reformation, the convents then, the women were basically thrown out. There were some really horrible, distressing sections where she talks about male invasion of the convents and all the terrible things that were done to the women, and then the appropriation of the property of the convents being then taken into male hands, such as the example in Cambridge where the convent of the Order of St Radegund became actually what's now Jesus College in Cambridge. So so she talks about that, but and how really it wasn't until the 19th century that she says that the whole kind of phenomenon of communities of women in these sort of religious orders started to sort of gain momentum again. I thought the final section, her conclusion, was really interesting, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but
we are,
yeah. So, but maybe we can return to this, because I thought if you remember where both Janice Raymond and Pat Hines, she quotes Pat as well, where they're talking about the sort of strengths of the life in the convent in terms of providing a structure for female friendship, and they compare that with their experiences of the feminist movement. I thought that was really interesting, but maybe, I don't know, maybe that's something we could perhaps return to at the end.
Yes, Pat Hines, of course, is her partner, and they were both in convents but did not meet there. But they both have pieces in a book I should mention, I think, which is Lesbian Nuns Breaking the Silence, a very, very interesting anthology from women who were nuns and then, of course, became they were lesbians probably in the convent and certainly outside, and were very important in the philosophy and culture of the feminist movement, lesbian feminist movement in the 1980s. So that book's really useful. The next chapter focuses on the Chinese marriage resistance movement, which I think is very interesting, and I don't think many of us knew much about until the book came out. Which is that in China, from the mid-19th century to the 1930s, it was interrupted by the revolution, of course, there was a mass marriage resistance movement in China around the areas where there was a silk industry, because the women were able to be in the silk industry and get some independence, some economic independence, and they set up vegetarian halls, I like that as a vegetarian, or spinster houses, and lived together. And apparently a little anecdote from that is sometimes the women were married off by their families because the families were so hostile to women. The women were simply sold off basically as children into marriages in those days. Sometimes the women were married off, but they could return to the vegetarian hall, and if after 3 days their sewn on clothes were intact, they were allowed to sort of come back and be part of the community. So their sisters sewed them into their clothes. They were sent off to be married. They managed to fight off the man, and they were able to come back to the community. And some apparently in the communities would provide and pay for concubines for the men they'd been married off to, so that they didn't have to go and sexually service their husbands. I mean, very, very fascinating, really fascinating. And many were forced to emigrate when the communists took over, and they went to places like Singapore, and some of the movement carried on till the 1970s, apparently, according to Jan. Anyway, I'll leave that chapter there, fascinating though it is, and move on to the chapter 4, which is called Obstacles to Female Friendship, because I do think a lot of this is really important. And Julia and I will sort of divvy up the crucially important obstacles that she talks about. And Julia's going to talk first, I think, about dissociation.
I must say, I really love it. I think this is my favourite chapter. There's just so much to think about, and to think how relevant things are today, in respect to the time that it was written. But yeah, so one of the first obstacles that Janice Raymond talks about in this chapter, and she says that the purpose of the chapter is to examine what she terms very directly as woman-hating conduct, and to try to really think about what that's about and what are the factors that militate, or what are the types of thinking or types of behavior that militate against gynaefection. So the first one that she talks about is dissociation, and what she means by that is a kind of dissociation, a withdrawal from the world, and she uses Hannah Arendt's idea of worldlessness, and what she means by that is withdrawal from and a lack of involvement in, and lack of striving to have any kind of control or influence in the world. I mean, I know that other writers, maybe such as Sonia Johnson, would say, well, she's talking about the patriarchal world, and that isn't the entirety of the world. But what she is talking about is, I suppose, the world that we know and inhabit in terms of the male-dominated world. And she is I find she's quite scathing about separatists that she sees as women, that she's the risk of separatism in the sense of withdrawing totally from the world as she sees it, is that you can end up with what she says is a worm's eye view of the world, that you end up living a life that isn't kind of politically informed, that isn't politically conscious, that becomes smaller and smaller. And she says that the more that women dissociate, the more catastrophic the effect can be. And she's very scathing about what she talks about as withdrawal from the world. I know later on, in the final chapter, she uses the term inside outsider to say, to try to philosophize a position for women with, sort of a primary communities and relationships of gynaefection, but that are very much within the world and seeking to change and shape and influence and transform the patriarchal world. I know that when we had a chat about this before, we started to talk about the ideas of tactical and strategic separatism, and the idea of withdrawing in order to then kind of come back and shape. I personally think that I find her too dismissive of women's withdrawal, because I think that if women want to withdraw and create their own communities, I think there's a huge kind of possibility and creativity in that. And I think there are certain things that can only be achieved, as her book itself seems to imply, by withdrawing and not being in relation to men. So I find her a bit too quick to dismiss that. And I just think of women that I know who worked within the women's sector, several decades ago, in terms of supporting, women who've experienced male violence, who then separated and bought some land and created a women's land there, which is a really, really fantastic place. And I don't think that wouldn't exist if they just continued to be these inside outsiders within the world that they were inhabiting before. Do you see what I mean? And I think there's that kind of opportunity for creativity sometimes can only be achieved by that level of separatism. So anyway, I don't know what you think about that, Sheila.
I like her idea of insider outsider. I think there's a difference culturally and simply because of geography between Britain and the US. So there was lots and lots of women's land in the US, and lots of women were able to go and live on that land. And I see the crucial importance of that, because they are a reservoir of community and love that other women can seek out. They can create poetry and culture and music, which is invaluable to everybody. So I see the importance of that women's land. But I think she was there, and she obviously felt that too many of those women then had nothing to do with trying to change the world for women in other ways, that is activism. obviously she sees as crucial. And I mean, obviously I've never had a separatist life of living on women's land. I've been teaching in universities and so on. But I like the concept of insider outsider because, yes, I was inside in the sense that I was in there trying to teach women and write books and in campaigning around prostitution and so on. But I was an outsider definitely because I was a separatist. My world is women, women come first. But I was a separatist not in the sense of being on women's land, but in terms of the community I was in. Not much of that community remains now. So I like the insider-outsider concept, but I also agree with you that there's a lot to those women's communities that's really extremely valuable. Now, what's next time, there's so many of these very important obstacles of female friendship, and we have 10 minutes, so I'm going to swiftly go through mine, I think, here. The next one she talks about is therapism, the growth of the industry of therapy, particularly feminist therapy and lesbian therapy. I think feminists found this a way that they could be outside the world of men and dealing with women and still making money. But of course, it was a terrible problem, the individualism of therapy and the sort of anti-activism of therapy, really, the way people were encouraged to look at their navels and think that anger was a difficulty and so on. So therapism was a huge problem for feminism and for friendship. I mean, feminists used to talk about real problems like, if you see your therapist in the street, you have to pretend you haven't seen her. Well, yes, that was a rule. How extraordinary when we were trying to create these egalitarian, different kinds of relationships with each other. So therapism was a huge problem for creating equal relationships between women. It rose and the women's community and politics disappeared with it. I mean, and these things did happen at the same time. So that's really interesting. And now another issue, I think, is victimization, which you might wish to say something about, Julia.
Yes, victimization, and then I think she calls it victimism, where she talks about the phenomenon of within feminism that where women's primary identity is grounded in the shared sense of having been victimized by men. And she talks about victimism. What she means by that is she says, within feminism as a constant and one-dimensional focus on the sharing of pain and the kind of endlessly repeated narration of pain. And she says that victimism ultimately negates self-definition and self-responsibility in the world, and it leads to women experiencing ourselves and thinking ourselves as world sufferers rather than world makers, which I think is really at the heart of that problem. And I think a lot of what she says is really pertinent to some of the things that maybe we see today in terms of, obviously there's been the whole phenomenon of technologization and social media and the way in which certain narratives can get circulated very quickly. And I think it can often, it can lead to kind of, what she says later on, I think, is thoughtlessness as a kind of sloganeering and a kind of an easy conceptualization of what feminism is about and what it's for, rather than having a kind of a thoughtfulness that actually encourages us to think of ourselves as world makers and world changers rather than world sufferers. So I was thinking of things maybe like the Me Too movement, where all women were expected or kind of encouraged to define themselves very much in terms of like, this is what this man has done to me, and this is, yeah. So I'm not saying it's not important for women to share those experiences, but I think it can get stalled at that level of the narration of myself as a victim. And what I see as well, maybe a lot of us have seen on social media, that there's a kind of a valorization of disclosure, so that if someone discloses something on Twitter or Facebook, there's lots of kind of, I don't know, lots of affirmation of that, without really going beyond, like with the old style of consciousness raising, without going beyond into a realm of analysis and politicization. It just stops at that level of, this is my pain, this is what I've been through, and then, you know, everyone's all kind of stying and brave as a result of that disclosure. And I think something else that really came to me as I was reading that section on victimism is the way in which victim status is kind of becomes reified, and there's a kind of reverence. If someone speaks in from this position as a victim, they're seen as having, or they or we, whoever it is seen as having an authority simply through having had a terrible experience of male violence or whatever it is. And I think particularly now in terms of maybe some of the stories of detransition as well, because someone's been through this terrible experience of transition, that they're given this authority that means that if you challenge what they say, you're seen as being mean or bad or nasty. But just the very fact of having been through a terrible experience doesn't necessarily mean that every word that comes out of your mouth is going to be helpful or accurate or feminist. And so I think that section on victimism really speaks a lot to some of the things that we see today.
Yes, I think so, Julia, and women are liking what you're saying in the chat, because it really is something that's happening now. In the absence of feminism, a form of victimism is, I think, taking place out there, which of course often uses the language of therapy and is concerned with those very, I think, harmful concepts of therapy. We haven't got much time. I'll just briefly talk about tyranny of tolerance. She says the tyranny of tolerance is one of the obstacles to female friendship. This idea that men are terrible to women, and we can criticize that, but we should be sympathetic to other women and not criticize what they're doing. And therefore there should not be criticism of sadomasochism and so on and so on. And of course, the tolerance of sadomasochism, and I think now of role-playing, is, I think, very, very damaging to feminism and lesbian feminism. So I think she's absolutely right about the tyranny of tolerance. I think it's a really good phrase, and I've used it a lot since then. I'm thinking we should move on to just our final thoughts about this, which really is, what's the difference between then and now? So, we're in a different social and political context now. What does it mean for now, Julia?
Well, what a shame we've got 4 minutes to talk about this. One of the things that she says really early on is the way in which the word friendship has become, women's friendship has become trivialized. And she says, things like cleaning products being advertised as a woman's best friend. And what I was thinking in terms of now is, probably the most frequently that we hear this term friendship is in terms of Facebook, like friends, and the whole the turning into a verb of like friending and unfriending, and the absolute sort of trivialization of the concept of friend. And to me, that really kind of encapsulates the difference between the sort of depth of thought that went into this and the current usage and the impact of social media that reduces friendship to like a click of a click on something on Facebook, which is actually, which is very much a male invented and male constructed reality. So I think, the whole phenomenon of social media has obviously changed things very sort of dramatically. And I think the kind of narratives of what feminism is and what feminism constitutes and what feminism is about is it doesn't really lend itself to the kind of depth of thinking of that Raymond gave to this book, and was far more possible, I think, at the time. So I think that's a big challenge. I wonder, I know within our community there'll probably be a lot of women who, if they haven't read it, want to go back and read this book, but I wonder really, I think we really live in such an accelerated society, and I wonder how many women would actually go and feel that they've got the time and opportunity and attention span to devote to thinking of female friendship in the depth that she suggests. What do you think, Sheila?
I think that may be true. I mean, obviously, society's hugely speeded up. It's hugely speeded up by tech and by social media and all of those things. The female friendship she talks about was carried out face to face, and women stayed with each other for weekends, spent a lot of time in each other's company. It was slowed down. They walked with each other and developed ideas and so on. It's hard to imagine that now. On the one hand, though, it's absolutely marvelous we have this tech, because there's women from many different countries able to be involved in this discussion now, which is fantastic. But friendship is something much more than that. And I think it is the basis of community. And so it's very, very difficult to imagine how that can happen now. But we need to be having these conversations, and this book is a really, really good way of starting it, I think. Any other thoughts?
Well, I do want to say, I don't want to be totally sort of doom and gloom, because I do think it's going, certainly I can say in my own life, we are very, very small numbers now, but I certainly do have a feeling of lesbian feminist friendship, very much so, very, very much, I guess, in terms of my actual life rather than online life, you know, smaller maybe than I might have imagined. I don't necessarily feel particularly that there's a much wider sense of it, but in terms of those things like sharing time, creating community, I don't want to say that I have no experience of that, because that really isn't true at all. So I don't know what you think, Sheila. I think but it's not nurtured by a wider, larger movement, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yes, I think there's a few of us, a handful and so on, rather than a community. You can't go to places and be absorbed in a mass of women who are all excitedly thinking the same thing. But I do very much appreciate the friendships that internationally I'm developing through these webinars and in other ways. I think it's marvelous the women I'm able to communicate with, but it is different. And maybe that's where we should leave it. So thanks, Julia, for a fascinating conversation, and we shall do it again.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks, everybody.